pick up our discussion about the Cold War with where we left off with the Iron Curtain speech. This was something that we did read in class, and clearly it was an unofficial declaration of the Cold War because Churchill directly called out Stalin and the Soviet attempt to spread his influence and expand through Europe and establish communism as the driving force. Churchill and Truman were seen as issuing this joint declaration against Stalin, and so therefore the lines were being drawn of who was going to be on what side of the Cold War. We had also mentioned that prior to the Iron Curtain speech, Stalin made a speech of his own. It was called the Two Worlds speech. It's also been called the Two Camps speech, and I had got this from the book that I used to use when teaching about the Cold War called A Hard and Bitter Peace. It is actually in your book, which I didn't realize, but because it's known as its other name, on on page 29. And it's called the Two Camps speech in your book, but it's also known as the Two Worlds speech. And this is where Stalin himself, before Churchill delivered the Iron Curtain speech, said that there were pretty much two hostile camps in the world, the communist camp and the capitalist camp. And he highlighted the ideas of Marxist theory of communism, and that was what was being carried out in the Soviet Union, and it was a valid, noble system, and those who were against it were on the other camp, and that war was inevitable. So therefore the Soviets would have to prepare themselves for a coming fight, and they would have to do so through heavy industry. Although this speech by Stalin is not given usually as much attention as the Iron Curtain speech, pretty much this was his declaration, unofficially anyways, of the Cold War. After Stalin made this two-world speech, the Canadians fessed up to a couple of things. The fact that they had rounded up some Soviet-sponsored atomic spy rings headed by a Canadian scientist. So they disclosed that information. And the Soviets then, after the speech was made, refused to participate in the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank because they saw that as being dominated by capitalist countries like the United States. Also, it helped to inspire George Kennan to write his long telegram, which in your book can be found on page 20. And it, again, the Kennan speech was very influential in forming the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, which we'll be talking about in a second. But again, to summarize Kennan's long telegram, he came to the conclusion that the Soviet Union was not going to be willing to directly combat the United States with outright war, but that they were going to try to manipulate and expose any weaknesses that they could to expand the communism as much as possible throughout Europe and also into other parts of the world, such as Asia. The only way to stop the Soviets, Kennan concluded, was to use force, because the Soviets respected force and intimidation, and that's the only way that they would respond. So this theory of Kennan's is what Truman and his advisors used to develop the policies for the early part of the Cold War. So then after this, the Iron Curtain speech was made, and this was seen as an Anglo-American bilateral endorsement of action against the Soviet threat. Churchill specifically mentioned an Iron Curtain sealing off Eastern Europe from the rest of the world, and that was against what these three leaders, himself, Truman, and Stalin, had come to agreements to during the wartime conferences. So this Iron Curtain speech was a definite hardening of opinions on both sides and a definite line drawn as to which side you were going to be on from this point on in the Cold War. Now let's look at the first main American policy of the Cold War, which was known as the Truman Doctrine. You have to understand the background of it first. If you look back in your book on page 19, you can see some issues that were happening in the countries of Greece and Turkey. And in both of those countries, there were situations where communist forces and rebellions had broken out, and there was concern as to whether these countries were going to be overcome with communist victories, and therefore communism would spread even farther than it had with the Eastern European countries that Stalin took over after World War II. So given that situation, Truman was concerned as to what our role should be in response to this. In the situation with Greece, the British had committed forces to try to intervene in that civil war. Problem was, if you look on page 24 of your book, that with the devastation of World War II, the British government was hugely in debt, and they could no longer continue to offer assistance to the Greek government. And if that was the case, then the communist forces could easily be victorious in the Greek Civil War. It was pretty much assumed that Stalin was indirectly supporting these communist forces in Greece, even though he claimed not to be. And so therefore, Americans interpreted, and Truman in particular, interpreted this as Stalin deliberately trying to expand communism throughout the continent of Europe. Similar situation in Turkey, and what scared us about Turkey was that that was seen as kind of an access point to the Middle East with its oil. And we definitely didn't want the Soviets to have a military presence in the Middle East. In addition to that, the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 was getting ready to break out, and Zionist forces and Arab forces were clashing in Palestine. And so, given the situation altogether in the Middle East, we didn't want to see Turkey fall to communism. So, on March 12th of 1947, Truman made a very influential speech in Congress, which became known as his Truman Doctrine. And in it, he said, quote unquote, that the United States had the obligation to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This was something that he developed with the influence of several factors. A lot of it had to do with Kennan's telegram and the fact that Kennan recommended that force be used and being able to stand up to Stalin as the only way for Stalin to back down. Also, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, where he deliberately called out Stalin for wanting to desire expansion throughout Europe and sealing off Eastern Europe with an Iron Curtain. And so this was the beginning of the American policy of containment, which would continue for the next 30 to 40 years and take the United States into places like Korea and into Vietnam and into countries in Latin America and the Middle East. Truman never realized how broad this doctrine could be interpreted, but it did commit us for the next 40 years to responding to quote-unquote communist threats all throughout the world. This is not in your book, but in the other book that I used to use, is explained how Truman had to build up support for this Truman Doctrine because it was in such direct contrast to our previous foreign policy before World War II of isolationism. Truman met with key congressional leaders on February 27th of 1947, just a couple weeks before he made the speech to Congress to kind of outline what his speech was going to entail and what the Truman Doctrine was going to be. There was some concern over the nature of this, but he also had congressional leaders definitely pushing him towards this decision of the Truman Doctrine. There's a quote in the other book where one of the Congress members were speaking to President Truman, and he said that the only way the president was going to get our country behind this new policy of intervention rather than isolationism was to scare Americans half to death of the fact that the communists could take over the world. So Truman, feeling out what the response would be, encountered both hesitation to this new change in policy, but also definite support for it. George Kennan himself was actually apprehensive, even though he's the one who recommended that we stand up to Stalin. He was a little concerned with the wording of this speech and how it could be interpreted very broadly, which ironically that's exactly what happened. It committed American forces for years to come in different parts of the world. This Truman Doctrine is seen as an official declaration of the Cold War, whereas the previous speeches by Stalin and Churchill were seen as unofficial declarations of the Cold War. It was initially meant for aid to specifically Greece and Turkey, because those were the two countries that I talked about in the background that we were concerned about communism taking over. But this plan was then used to justify American action elsewhere in the world. An example of that would be in the resumption of the Chinese Civil War, where the communist and nationalist forces were fighting once again, and the United States decided to give aid to the nationalists to try to hold off the communists, which we were unsuccessful in doing. It came about in 1950 with the Korean situation and the threat of communism. It would come about with Vietnam beginning in 1954, and in many countries in Latin America, such as Chile, in the Middle East with the situation in Palestine. All of these places were the result of the Truman Doctrine, allowing America to have an ability to justify us getting involved. Finally, let's look at the corresponding economic policy to the Truman Doctrine, which was called the Marshall Plan. We discussed this a little bit at the end of the World War II unit, and going along with the idea that communism was a direct threat to our ideology and our political system, we realized that Europe was in a state of devastation after World War II and could easily fall to communism if something wasn't done to improve the economic conditions. Stalin was pretty much banking on the fact that the economic devastation of Europe would result in an easy victory of communism over the European countries. It had done so already in Eastern Europe, and he figured this could continue, which supports the cartoon that's on page 20 of your book, where France was definitely scared of this communist threat, being devastated as they were economically. Our country had definite success with our economy during World War II. It put people back to work, and we had the ability to produce massive amounts of goods, food, and we had the cash flow needed to forestall communism taking over Europe. So the plan itself was designed by General George C. Marshall, who was an influential general during World War II, and he had focused the president's attention on Europe at the return of him from a conference in Moscow, and the fact that countries in Europe like Britain and France, who were used to taking the leadership role, were now not able to do so, and that the communists could then win elections even in France and Italy if the economic conditions didn't improve. So on June 5th of 1947, just a few months after the Truman Doctrine speech was made in Congress, George Marshall made a speech at the commencement ceremonies of Harvard University and basically outlined what would become the Marshall Plan. And the emphasis, like George Kennan recommended, which is referenced in the other book, was that this plan have a tone of being pro-European rather than anti-communist, so that it didn't look like we were trying to influence these European countries in any certain way to make them look exactly like the United States. If you look on page 26, you can see where those concerns came from, and we didn't want to be labeled a bad guy or being manipulative here. So what we did basically was we had a lump sum of money, about $17 billion, and these European countries would have to apply for the aid, so they would have to take the initiative. There would be a list of conditions that they would have to follow to receive the money, so there were strings attached. But basically the emphasis was for these countries to use the money to rebuild their economies, and therefore as a result democracy could flourish because people would not be desperate economically. We, in turn, could closely monitor the distribution of these funds and how they were being put to use in these countries, and therefore we could keep a handle on the situation. You can see a graph on page 26 of your book of the countries that received Marshall Plan aid. Some received a lot more so than others, definitely the British and the French, being that they were our closest allies during World War II, but you can see the other countries that received aid, and it was all across the continent of Europe that got aid from the United States. This plan made the United States look very humanitarian, altruistic, and wanting the good of the continents, rather than us looking manipulative. So it was carried out in a very strategic way with good PR publicity, and this was deliberately done by George Kennan to make our country look like we were being very helpful in this situation, which we were, but of course we know that we had our own aims to seek out as well. The Soviet reaction to this was obviously negative. They saw this as clear proof that we were going against the United Nations and that we were trying to create imperialism in a new way. If you look on page 27, you can see the Soviet reaction and with a political cartoon that goes with it, and a speech that was given by the Soviet foreign minister where he called us out, saying that we were violating the principles and the process of the United Nations, and that we were attempting to split Europe into two camps. So they definitely didn't see us as positive in this. Their response was to create something called the Molotov Plan, which you can see on page 28, and the result of that was Comecon, which we've also mentioned before, which stands for Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. On paper, it was to stimulate, quote-unquote, and control the economic development and support the collectivization of agriculture and the development of heavy industry in Eastern Europe. But pretty much the underlying thing here was that the Soviets were using and exploiting these economies of Eastern Europe for Soviet benefits. So therefore, these Eastern European countries did not recover nearly as much as Western European countries were that were receiving the Marshall Plan aid. Along with this, Stalin decided to create an organization called Cominform, which was the replacement of Comintern. It stands for Communist Information Bureau, and this was the way that Stalin could keep tabs on the communist parties that were in these Eastern European countries to make sure that they were in line with what Moscow wanted. An example of Cominform in action was when they deliberately induced a wave of strikes across the countries of France and Italy that were intended to overthrow the democratic governments and replace them with communism. This organization actually decreased and damaged the appeal of Stalinism in the nations of Western Europe once it was realized that they were attempting to take over Western Europe with communism. In the next recording, we'll pick up with the Berlin crisis by introducing it with one more article written by George Kennan called the X article.